everyone. Let's continue with our discussion on Aristotle's concept of tragic catharsis as given in his text Poetics. In my previous video, I have referred to the interpretation of the term catharsis with reference to the purgation theory, that how the critics who interpret catharsis as purgation, they have tried to explain the term catharsis, or they have tried to explain the process of how the tragic and the feelings of pity and fear lead to tragic pleasure, and they have interpreted it in terms of pathology, in terms of psychology, and some of the critics talk about the ethical interpretation. But the point where all of them agree, they talk about this purgation just to achieve a balanced state of emotions of pity and fear. In this video, we'll talk about purification and clarification theories regarding the explanation or interpretation of the term catharsis. The critics who believe in the purification theory of catharsis, they look at this term as a moral conditioning, that is to say, and these critics, they reject the interpretation of catharsis in the light of medical terminology. And here the critic Humphrey House comes into mind. He says that Aristotle's concept of catharsis was not as a medical term. He interprets the word to mean a kind of moral conditioning which the spectator undergoes. Humphrey House comments that purgation means cleansing, and this cleansing may be quantitative evacuation or qualitative change in the body in the restoration of the proper equilibrium. In this context, Humphrey House says, I quote, "A tragedy arouses pity and fear from potentiality to activity through worthy and adequate stimuli. It controls them by directing them to the right objects in the right way and exercises them within the limits of the play as the emotions of the good man would be exercised," unquote. Students, actually Humphrey House wants to say that Aristotle's whole doctrine, his whole philosophy, whole theory only makes sense if we realize the proper balance of the emotion depend upon the habitual direction of them towards worthy objects. So, this is how the purification theory explains catharsis in terms of emotional equilibrium. And lastly, there is clarification theory. There are some critics who show that the implications of catharsis are to be found in the poetics itself without any need to refer to politics or ethics, as the critics of the purification school of theory talk about. They say that if we go to the beginning of from where Aristotle's theory originates, the imitation theory that writing of the imitative arts, Aristotle points out that the pleasure in the imitative arts is connected with learning. Pleasure does not come from joy alone. And he says that even the pictures of dead bodies can give pleasure if well executed. This shows that the pleasure is linked with learning. The pleasure is there in anything fitted to instruct. So it seems a paradox that even the ugly and the repellent things can give pleasure. So a similar paradox lies there in tragedy. The incidents of tragedy are painful, and they might present the horrible situation of a man blinding himself, or a woman killing her husband, or a mother killing her child. Such events would horrify us, and they repel us in real life. Yet in tragedy, they afford us a special pleasure. And according to Aristotle, this pleasure is peculiar to tragedy. Aristotle himself tells that tragedy has its own kind of pleasure, and we must seek from it this pleasure, the pleasure that is proper to it. And catharsis involves such a pleasure. So the function of tragedy is to provide the pleasure peculiar to it. And this pleasure involves the presentation of events which arouse pity and fear. According to this theory, clarification theory of poetry, that catharsis becomes an indication of the function of tragedy, not of its emotional effect on the audience. The point is that the catharsis is related to the incidents of the tragedy. I repeat, students, this clarification theory differs from the other two theories, that here catharsis is not related to the emotions of pity and fear evoked in the audience. It does not talk about the effect on audience. It talks about, or it related with the incidents of tragedy, and it involves, or it explains catharsis as a process of learning. So just to be more clear, or to have a better understanding of this theory, we just have a look at how this process of learning takes place. The critics say that the clarification of the essential and universal significance of the incidents depicted in a tragedy. The essential and universal significance of the incidents depicted in tragedy. When we watch a movie, or when we go for a play which has a tragic end, we just through the presentation of those very incidents, or the plot of those very events, we realize, we got a clarification of the essential significance of those incidents, and this clarification leads to an enhanced understanding of the universal law. And then we believe that this universal law governs human life and destiny. And this understanding leads to the pleasure of tragedy. In other words, we can say that tragic pleasure rises from the fact that imitation produces that sort of pleasure which comes from learning. And this learning comes from our discovery of a certain relationship between the particular events presented in the imitation and certain universal elements embodied in it. As I have already been remarked, that poet selects and orders his material according to the law of probability and necessity. This we have discussed in our talk on the plot in tragedy. A poet presents what might be and more than what is. This is what makes a poet more philosophical than a historian. Here is the point where the clarification theory seems to be very close to the Aristotelian idea of the tragic pleasure. The purgation theory and the purification theory of catharsis, they have their own way of looking at catharsis. These two theories, they have their limitations. They cannot explain the whole process involved in the catharsis. A fundamental drawback of these theories is that these theories are concerned with the effect of the tragedy on the audience, that is, with the psychology of the audience. Both views concentrate not on what tragedy says or what tragedy is, but what tragedy may do to us. They just treat pity and fear as a reference to something in the audience rather than to scenes and elements in the play. And in actuality, Aristotle was writing a treatise on the art of poetry, and he was concerned more with the technique of writing poetry than with the audience psychology. So, as the theories of psychology, the two theories, they are not bad, they are not altogether wrong, but it is doubtful if it explains the term as Aristotle intended it to mean. So, most of the modern critics, they advocate the clarification theory because this theory refers to the incidents of tragedy rather than to the reaction of the audience. It is more concerned with what tragedy is, that is, with the nature of the tragedy. According to this theory, purgation or purification is not incidental to the pleasure of tragedy, but comprehension of the relation of the particular to the universal as embodied in tragedy brings about a peculiar pleasure. In other words, we can say it is an intellectual pleasure which lies in realizing the relationship between the hamartia, the tragic flaw of the hero or the protagonist, and the suffering which results, and the relationship between character and destiny. So there is a design incorporated into the tragedy. The elevation of pity and fear is a byproduct of the learning process, not the chief object of tragedy. Thus, the term catharsis has been interpreted so variously that it is difficult to come to an agreement as to what Aristotle really meant. Of the theories advanced to explain catharsis, the clarification theory appears to be the most acceptable perhaps. I'll repeat, because this theory tends to relate catharsis to the work, to tragedy as a work of art, rather than the psychology of the audience. And after all, Aristotle was writing on the art of poetry, not about the effect of poetry. But all the same, students, the last word on catharsis has not yet been said, but it is very clear that catharsis talks about the emotional appeal or the main function of tragedy, and it is something which deals with the betterment of human life or the betterment of human society. That was Aristotle's main aim, main function, or the basic doctrine behind his theory of poetry as a work of art. Thank you.